This is the Insider's Guide to Real Estate. Today our topic is the Village. My guest today is Matthias Rosenfeld, who is a principal with New Habitat Partners and a developer of VillageWorks. We'll talk a bit in detail about his project, but first join me in welcoming Matthias to our program. Hello, Matthias.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Sure. Thanks for coming. So before we get into the details about VillageWorks, let's talk in general about the concept of a village. Historically, I think we all carry around this image of a village, self-contained community where people live and work and trade and defend each other. Mm-hmm. But the modern concept's a lot different than that. So what is, from a developer's perspective, what is a village today?
Well, I really see a village as a center for local commerce, a center for civic life, a center for people to come together and be together and work together and play together and learn together. It's really about community and bringing people, especially in the suburbs, the Metro West suburbs where we are, that are living separated from each other into a center of gravity.
Okay, so there's a physical nature to a village, proximity. People need to be close to one another, mm-hmm. where they live, where they work. Going back historically, many of the areas that we are comfortable in that have this kind of village feel to it are older areas, mm-hmm. and your project is in West Acton, West Concord. Many communities have these old Main Street or village centers that were developed sometimes 100 years ago or longer. Though they were developed before there was any zoning. Mm-hmm. Before World War II, the concept of zoning didn't exist. So modern zoning decided, well, let's separate uses. Let's keep where people live in one area, where people work in another, and where people trade and shop in yet another. That's flawed. You have had some personal experience that a while back that made an impression on you in your early days. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I went to college in Boulder, out in the Front Range of Colorado. I was there in the 90s. And I saw in the course of 4+ years, the Front Range transformed from really what was an open prairie land to a heavily developed in a rushed and some might say irresponsible manner. And you could see how that impacted the people that lived there. Just driving between Denver and Boulder, all you would see were these tract houses sort of stacked on top of one another. Everything looked the same. It was difficult to orient yourself, to know where you were. If you were going out to dinner, your choices were chains, usually in malls or strip malls. And you had to drive and battle increasingly difficult traffic to get to it. I found it very isolating. And after college, I moved back east, and I lived in New York for a while. I lived in Boston. I lived in Cambridge. And I really could feel the difference between a walkable city center or town center versus the sprawling and disassociated.
Okay. So somebody was buying those homes in those tracts. Why? What drew people to them? And developers were building these large tracts, and I think we've all seen them. Mm-hmm. Levittown is an example, in this part of the world. But what people lived in cities, and we became more suburban after World War II. What was the attraction? What drove people into these types of developments that were, and you're not the only one who experienced this kind of discomfort, but what drove them away from the cities?
Well, I think there are a number of forces that led to it. But one, you said what drove them to these places, and that's literally the car is what brought people out to the suburbs. These villages, these towns that you talked about at the beginning of the show were developed 100 years ago before people had cars. People needed to be near each other because that's how commerce functioned, that's how community functioned, and you couldn't hop in your car and in 15 minutes be 15 miles away. I think with the invention of the car, with highways, it brought great expanses of land that were very inexpensive, and developers were able to start building very inexpensively and create inexpensive homes, and it allowed people to escape from the congestion of the city. Cities were dirty, they were crowded, and there was suburbia was really marketed by developers and by banks as the next sort of paradise. So people went out there and they could afford to have their own little kingdom, their own land. But with that came a different experience of community.
Sure. So the story that I've heard is that when Dwight Eisenhower became president, one of the things he remembered about all of his experiences in Europe was he was very impressed with the German Autobahn, the concept of these limited access highways, and we brought about the Interstate Highway Act, which really facilitated a lot of this development. And not to be too critical of that, I mean, much of our economic growth and prosperity is linked to the automobile and the interstate highway, but now it seems there is an interest on the part of some, not everyone, in this kind of village concept. And then when you add to it the whole idea of energy conservation, global warming, they seem to converge. Is that accurate?
I think so. I mean, you look at the amount of resources that an American home, or just an American, uses in their daily life. People spend an hour or two every day driving to work. While they're driving to work, they're burning fuel. They come home, they have a 3,000 square foot house. Those 3,000 square feet have to be heated. When you live in a village, or when you can walk to work, or when you have a more compact footprint, your carbon footprint is reduced. And if you're able to walk to work every day, you get more exercise. You aren't burning fossil fuels. You're on the sidewalk saying hello to people, as opposed to being in an isolated experience.
Right. So that in addition to kind of getting back to something basic, we are social beings. When you add to that the need to be more conscious of the energy we consume, that kind of points to a more dense, more compact living, working environment. And also, I think you mentioned spending an hour a day commuting to work. Despite the availability of more open space, there's a limit to how far people will commute, and we see that in real estate. A 45-minute commute is acceptable. An hour is pushing it. So you have these now. As time goes by, developers begin to look at these older village or main street settings and think that there might be opportunity there. That in some cases these villages have been I don't want to say abandoned, but particularly commerce within those areas is less. So another part of our economy that came about with this sprawl was the invention of the mall, just taking all these, particularly retail, putting them together in one location. And that was popular, but not so much now. So what's happened to the American mall?
Well, the American mall is changing rapidly, and I think the mall developers are changing their models. And you're seeing, you look back at the 80s, the big indoor covered malls. Those are not built so much anymore. Now what's being built are these lifestyle centers. That's sort of the product that the developers have created. And the lifestyle center is in many ways the same thing as the covered mall of the 80s, but it's been redesigned to have sidewalks, be outdoors. They're changing the mix of businesses, trying to get more food, more types of businesses that you might see in a actual village, or that you might see in Harvard Square. But there's something, I feel, there's something missing in the authenticity of these lifestyle centers. To me, they still feel like they're very much a product. You go to them and they're often all the same businesses that you see in the malls or at the lifestyle center 10 miles down the highway. So you can change the physical design of a mall, but in order to really create a different experience, I think you also have to bring in different types of businesses and bring businesses with human faces attached to them, not just corporations.
Okay, different types of businesses. So the mall is really, initially anyway, the concept was basically to take Main Street and put a roof over it,
Yep.
protect it. And in this part of the country, in the Northeast, that had a lot of appeal. And malls are changing, and one of the changes that some malls are including is a residential component within the mall.
Mm-hmm.
How successful have those been?
You know, I think it's been met with mixed success. I know that there have been some places that have tried it, and it has ended up feeling a little funny. I've taken some tours of places, and I don't know if that's just my own the paradigm I'm in and how I view. It felt a little odd, but you know, I do think that there is a future. We have these huge pieces of land that have been developed as malls, and we have to find something positive to do with them, because as they shutter their doors, and as they have been shuttering their doors, it really is an opportunity to create a more dynamic and interesting place. These malls could become new centers for the towns. So I think the idea of bringing a residential component is a good one. I think it's the right direction to go, but it has to be part of a holistic rethinking of what this place is. It can't just be a mall with apartments on top of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's got to be a more thoughtful approach to it. The malls, I think that not, in addition to a generational perspective on where we live and where we shop, malls have been dramatically affected by the internet. A lot of retail is gone away from the malls, and so as you say, I can see from a real estate perspective that something's not working, and there might be a solution, and trying to figure out some way of combining them. Is there an issue of critical mass? I mean, you can't, if you're going to try to create a village from a mall, what are the metrics? What do you need to see as a developer to give you encouragement that combining this concept might work?
In a mall setting. Well, I think access is always critical. So wherever the site is going to have good access so that people from a wide area, especially if we're talking about the suburbs, are going to want to come here. And there has to be some sort of anchor, just like in the old mall that had the department store. There has to be some anchor that gives people a reason to come on a regular basis. And I think that's really where restaurants are taking such a huge role in the development world today. And you see it in the cities. Restaurants are popping up everywhere. Everybody wants a restaurant. And now you're seeing it out in the suburbs, because restaurants draw the market that has been living in Cambridge and in Boston and in Arlington, and now is now looking for a little bit more room and moving to the suburbs, still expects those amenities that they had when they were living in the city. And so to bring those amenities out to these mall locations or to these village locations, I think will create the traffic for these other businesses to mass around.
Right. So this historic concept of the village that I mentioned early on kind of transforms itself to the modern concept, where you have to acknowledge that it's not a closed economy, that you really have to provide for serving those who live within walking distance of this mall or village, but also you need to draw. So you can't, so again, the interstate highway system kind of in some ways facilitates development of this village or more dense community.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as much as as critical as walkability is, and I'm thinking about my own project in West Acton, we're really depending on, and we've seen it, evidence of this, that the surrounding neighborhoods are going to walk into the village. They're going to come on foot, they're going to ride their bikes and go to the businesses. But in order to be able to invest the money and have the rents and have the businesses operating at such a level that they can cover their costs and stay open, you need to draw people in.
Okay, well, let's talk more about VillageWorks, your
Sure.
project. In the interest of full disclosure, my company, Acton Real Estate, has become a tenant in your project.
Yep, we're very happy about that.
That's good to hear. So tell us, just in general, what is VillageWorks?
So VillageWorks is the result of a many-year and multi-phase redevelopment of a full village block in West Acton Village. It's the gateway into West Acton as you approach from the east. It's a total of around 50,000 square feet when you take all the buildings together, and we're just wrapping up our final phase of redevelopment as we speak. The purpose and the goal was to help West Acton become a more sustainable and more vibrant village center, and to really bring in critical mass that's necessary for all the businesses to succeed. Part of that is infrastructure, part of that is the mix of uses that we're bringing in. We're really trying to bring in, we have a restaurant coming in that's going to be drawing from a very wide area out here, a coffee shop. We have businesses like yours that are just essential to the economy, to the local economy. But we're looking to create a place that people want to come and spend their days and really integrate as part of their lives, not just to come and shop and consume.
Okay, so yours is a mixed use. You have retail, service, office space, but no housing component. So, but you did think about that. So what's the history of housing in VillageWorks?
Yes, we very much wanted to have a housing component. And in the first few iterations of our design and our planning, we actually had right now the second floor is largely professional commercial space. We have an assembly space, a community space for meetings and events. But in our preliminary plan, the second floor was townhomes. And we had actually created a roof deck with a community garden area, and it was ringed by townhomes with the idea that people who wanted to downsize and live in a more compact footprint but didn't want to leave Acton or wanted to stay out in the suburbs would have a nice option where they could live and walk downstairs and get dinner, go to work.
Right. But that didn't happen.
It didn't happen. Key to having that plan move forward was the expansion of the sewer into West Acton. Acton has a sewer right now, but it serves a limited area. And there's been talk for many years about bringing the sewer down Massachusetts Avenue into West Acton Village to serve the businesses. And at the time that we proposed this plan, there was a key vote on the sewer that was unrelated to our project, and they didn't move forward, which is unfortunate. And so we adjusted accordingly. But having a sewer in a village is a really critical piece of infrastructure if you're looking to bring in the types of businesses that a village needs.
Sure, and that has to do with in the absence of a sewer, you need to have an on-site sewage disposal system, and that takes up land area, and not to mention the expense of doing that. But
right, it's a very expensive prospect, and it does eat up a tremendous amount of land, and you can't cover it with buildings. The Mass Code requires it be left exposed. So we were fortunate to have the land area to be able to make this work. But it was very challenging.
Sure. So again, the modern concept of village, you have to deal with infrastructure. You mentioned sewage. There's also access and parking, and that's something that is a component, again, because you need, as you mentioned, you need to attract people from beyond the village itself. So what were some of the ways in which you dealt with the need to provide parking?
Well, the nice thing about a village is that if a village is really about collaboration, then you can plan collaboratively and make the resources shared. So as we were planning, one of the things we did is we surveyed all the on-street parking in the area. And we said, how many spaces are available? What are they utilized? What times are they utilized? And we did a pretty detailed study that showed that while the common thought about the village is that there's never any parking, there actually is quite a bit of parking. It's just spread out around the streets, and people have to know how to get there. So I think education is a big part of this, and creating a culture shift. If you go to Concord or Lexington or Cambridge, nobody expects to park right in front of the restaurant that they're going to eat at, or right in front of the business. People are willing to walk 5 to 10 blocks to get wherever they're going because it's an interesting walk. People are not used to that in Acton. It just hasn't been there. And so we've tried to create an interesting place for people to walk. We've put in sidewalks. We've added a lot more on-street parking. We've tried to make the traffic slower so it doesn't feel as aggressive to pedestrians. So we've introduced a bump out on Mass Ave that slows down traffic. We put in a crosswalk to the playground. We've brought bike racks in so people can cycle. So trying to get people there differently, trying to get them to the parking spaces that exist.
So there is a psychological component, and it's not just Acton, of course, it's everywhere. And what I always found interesting is although there is this expectation that you can park right at the door to do business, people will drive to a mall and park a considerable distance from the entrance to the mall and then walk pretty far within the mall to get to the business that they're headed for. So one thing I didn't realize, and this is an example of how sometimes you have conflict with public purpose. Like I think the zoning in the village does encourage more intensive use of both residential and commercial. But you have a state highway that runs right through the village, and state law says, or regulation says, there's no parking on the state highway. So how did you deal with that?
So that was a very interesting process. We essentially went to the state and said, for this project to work, we need people to be able to park. We need to have access to our buildings, and how would you feel about giving your portion of the road over to the town? And we had the support of the town. We worked very closely with town staff in coming up with how this would work. And we did a plan. We showed the state what we wanted to do. And they agreed to transfer the road. So it took around 2 to 3 years to go through the process, but it was relatively smooth as these processes go. Right. And once the transfer happened, we were able to put a new design down, and add all the new street parking, put the sidewalks in, and really change the feel
Sure.
as you enter the village.
So there's one thing in terms of political support for change, even though it took some time to do, I think adding parking is a politically popular thing to do. And so I suspect you didn't get a lot of pushback from residential users in the area because you were adding parking. I suspect that was a welcome change, but still taking 3 years. I mean, it's one thing to spend a lot of time on something if you have reason to believe you're going to be successful, and that did work out. One aspect of your development that I'd just like to talk about a little further is that you've devoted a considerable amount of space within your building for, you're calling it event space.
Mm-hmm.
So what's event space exactly, and what this is a business, obviously, this
Mm-hmm.
building, so what leads you to believe that this is good for business?
Well, so the event space we're calling the gallery, and it's on the second floor, and it's surrounded by our professional space. It's really a lobby that doubles as meeting space for all the tenants during the day, and as event space, concert space, movie space, party space, gallery space in the evenings. And the motivation behind it was really to create another draw into the village to help create that critical mass that the businesses need to survive. The more people you can have coming in and out of those doors, the more likely they're going to go stop and get a cup of coffee, the more likely it is that they'll recognize Acton real estate. They'll want to come back if there's interesting things going on. The project itself on the exterior is designed around 2 courtyards, and they're public courtyards with public seating. The idea being that people can come to the playground across the street with their kids, or just come and have a seat and drink a cup of coffee and hang out, and it holds the energy. In New England, those courtyards are not going to be very lively in January, and we wanted to have a place that throughout the year there could be interesting things going on. That bring people into town and bring people in the evenings, and that was sort of the genesis of this idea.
So it's a great it's a good mix, a fortuitous mix that you recognize something that is integral to a village. There's places for people to interact. That's also good for business, and I think that kind of a mix is good, again, from a real estate perspective. That's when you're likely to see change, is when there is consensus and there is this kind of synergy between what people like to do and feel comfortable doing and a business model. So speaking of business model, what are some of the experiences you've had that would be encouraging to other developers to take a look at these Main Street, these old village centers, and try to make them work?
Well, from a market perspective, this seems to be what the market is demanding right now. We've been overwhelmed with the amount of support that we've received from people who live in town, mm-hmm. people who have lived in town for 50 years and are thrilled to see what's happening. So there is a demand for this kind of place, and it brings challenges. You know, you're working in contexts that it's different than working on a big open green field. Mm-hmm. So it brings different challenges, but if you can respond to those contexts, work within the contexts, there's a real opportunity.
So you seem to be on track with a successful project, and I'm quite sure that there will be other developers taking a look at what you've done and trying to replicate it in other communities. So Matthias, I'd like to thank you for coming to our show.
Thank you.
And that is our show today. Thanks for watching.